Hi, you guys. So, the chapter that I'm studying for our research analysis paper is chapter 18, which is Ernest Bormann's Symbolic Convergence Theory. And I'm going to start off by kind of explaining the theory. I'm not going to go into full blown detail because there's a lot. I'm just going to kind of focus on two areas, which is dramatizing messages and fantasy. Just because those are, I think, in my opinion, two of the biggest parts of the entire chapter. And a lot of the sources that I've used are based on those two sections of the chapter as well. So I just think those are the most relevant and what you guys kind of really need to know about. So the symbolic convergence theory, I'm going to refer to it as SCT just because the book refers to it as that, and it's a lot less of a mouthful. It was adopted by Ernest Bormann from Robert Bales, who was a Harvard social psychologist, and he worked to categorize comments made in small group discussions. And Bales found that dramatizing messages was a significant type of communication, and it brought groups closer together. So I'm referring to my notes if you're wondering why I'm looking down. So he found that the dramatizing messages makes a significant difference in closeness of small groups. So Bormann kind of took that theory and tested it on actual small groups, and he just wanted to examine leadership prominence and cohesiveness and decision-making norms, stuff like that. And he ended up finding that that members often dramatize events outside of the group that might have happened previously, or dramatize events that could possibly happen in the future with that group. And so dramatizing messages basically, I'll give you the definition in the book, what it says, and I'll kind of explain it how I understand it. So how the book defines it is imaginative language by a group member describing past, future, or outside events, creative interpretations of there and then. And what it means is basically when you're in a small group and it's kind of like a snowball effect, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But the dramatizing messages is just as it sounds. It's just making messages more dramatic. And Bormann, there's a quote from Bormann in here, and he said, sharing group fantasies creates symbolic convergence. So that's like the symbolic convergence theory. When a group comes together because of dramatizing messages, it draws them closer together. And there's a really good example in the book that kind of helped me with the thought of dramatizing messages, because it was kind of confusing at first. I thought I'd understood it, but this made it clearer for me. It's called the Cabin 8 example, and it is told from a group leader just at a camp. And there's this group of 8 younger girls, and they're staying at this camp for a whole week, and they're all the different girls are staying in groups of 8 in different cabins. And this group is going to cabin 8, and on their way there, they're passing like all these super nice cabins, and they're so pretty, and they're getting all excited, and they get to cabin 8, and it's kind of like a dingy, dark cabin, and it's dirty, it's got spider webs all over, like the floor is all gross and sticky. And so obviously they were less than thrilled to be staying in that cabin. So what the group leader says is later in the day, they were walking just to their next event that they were doing for the day at camp, and the girls started talking about what their dream cabin would be like, and it included things like having huge beds and clean floors and like a sunroof so they could watch the stars, and having lounge chairs. And once one person said something about it, the other girls started adding in and saying, oh, this would be cool, this would be cool. And it created a sort of cohesiveness. So then it became like an inside joke, which is another part of Bormann's SCT as well. He does talk about how cohesiveness can create those different kinds of just inside jokes, and, you know, like how you have with your close friends, and that's what kind of makes you close, is stuff like that. So I just thought that that was a really good example, and that's kind of what helped me, because it became an ongoing joke with how crappy their cabin was. It brought them closer together as a group. And then Bormann actually also believed that dramatizing messages actually served groups rather than distracting from them, because in the book it also describes that some people find a lot of flaws in the symbolic convergence theory, because a lot of it can be based on jokes and dramatization. So a lot of the times that can be really distracting if you're in, say, like a work meeting or on a work phone call or something important like that. A lot of people deem it inappropriate to use dramatizing messages in that sense. However, Bormann's theory is working to prove that it actually helps group cohesiveness. And then there's also a part in the dramatizing messages about distinction, and that's a big part of it, between imagery and dramatizing. And dramatizing messages are different because they're interpretive, and dramatizing messages focus more on the then and there versus here and now. So when I was saying earlier how it dramatizes events that have happened or that could possibly happen, so it's saying what could have been or what would have been versus what's happening right now. Whereas imagery is more, it's more descriptive, and and that's why the distinction is so important, because the dramatizing messages can get mixed in that a lot. So it's just important to note the difference there. So that's really the dramatizing messages part. And then also the fantasy theme. That's another big part of Bormann's theory. And that focuses on dramatizing messages that are enthusiastically embraced by the entire group. And that's a direct quote from the book here on page 235. And what that is what I was talking about earlier, the snowball effect. So when one person says something about, like a joke, or like the cabin example is a perfect way to describe that. What the snowball effect is, when one person says something and another person reacts to it, and they're like, oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to add on to it. And you just it's a snowball effect. So it just goes from there, and that creates a sense of cohesiveness as well. And obviously fantasy, you think of, something that could have or would have been, so relating to the then and there versus here and now. And there's also, he calls it the fantasy chain. Bormann calls it the fantasy chain, and it's just an explosion of cohesiveness, and that's really what symbolic convergence is. And also the book does define symbolic convergence as two or more private worlds that incline toward each other, come more closely together, or even overlap, which is group consciousness or cohesiveness. So that is that part. And then in this stage, this is where group members no longer think like I, me, or my. They start to think more me, I'm sorry, we, us, and ours. So Bormann believed that when this occurred in a group, it was more important for them to memorialize it and sort of make it like a saga, give it a name, so that way you can reflect on the memories that you once had, and that maintains the cohesiveness that you have in your group. So now that I've kind of explained the topic, I'll tell you guys why I chose it. And that's just because I thought it was really interesting. I think it's really true, and it's so funny how you don't notice how, like the symbolic convergence that we witness every day, that we ourselves conform to, and it's just kind of cool just to see how it plays out in real life. And I just thought it was interesting too because of the dramatizing messages. I think I described it before in my previous post. No one probably remembers it, but I'm a very dramatic person myself, so I can relate heavily to the dramatizing of the messages. Okay, next I'm going to talk to you guys about two sources that I'm using that I think are the most important to note. So it's just kind of how I weaved in the literature with the research. The first one is called Homo narrans Paradigm. It's by Gabriel M. Vasquez. And also both of these scholarly peer-reviewed journals are from the Journal of Public Relations Research. So I kind of kept it to that. I kind of narrowed my searches down to that kind of area just because I think it just makes more sense. So, and what his journal does, it combines SCT with situational theory of publics. And in it, he describes that SCT focuses more on content of messages versus the situational theory, which focuses more on who the messages are directed at. I thought that was interesting when he put them together. And then he said together they create a paradigm that views the exchanging of messages between an organization and public forms of stories. And so what he also suggests is that public relations can be viewed as a social science, which I also thought was super interesting.